There's a moment in certain rituals that almost everyone who witnesses one describes the same way. The person changes, not gradually, not over weeks of therapy or months of medication, in the room, during the ritual itself. Someone who was shaking becomes still. Someone who couldn't speak finds their voice. Someone who had been, by any observable measure, not themselves, becomes themselves again. And the people in the room don't seem surprised. They expected it. They prepared for it. They created the conditions for it. And when it happened, they recognized it as the thing they came for. This happens in churches, in temples, in remote villages, in urban storefronts with folding chairs and fluorescent lights. It happens in traditions that have nothing else in common. Different theology, different cosmology, different language, different explanation for what's happening and why. But the same basic event. Someone is named as having something wrong with them that isn't quite them. A ritual is performed, and then, somehow, they're different. And here's the question that keeps sitting with me. Not whether what they believe is happening is literally true, but why does it work? Before we go further, if you're enjoying this, consider subscribing to Belief Explained Simply. We explore questions like this without rushing to conclusions. And if someone you know might appreciate this kind of conversation, share it with them. All right, let's continue. Let's start with something most people already know, even if they've never examined it. There's a condition recognized across cultures, across centuries, across medical and religious traditions, where a person seems to become someone else. Their voice changes, their face changes, their behavior, their language, the things they say and do, none of it resembles the person who was there before. The people who love them say, "That's not them," and they mean it literally. Something has entered, or something has taken over, or something has displaced the person they know. And the way to bring that person back, the way it's been understood to work across an almost impossible range of traditions, is to name what's there and command it to leave. Rituals for this exist in ancient Mesopotamia, in the Hebrew Bible, in the New Testament, in Islam, where the practice is called ruqya, in Hinduism, where it takes various forms across different regional traditions, in indigenous practices across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, in Pentecostal Christianity, practiced in churches on every continent. What's worth noticing isn't just that these rituals exist, it's that they follow remarkably similar structures. Diagnosis, confrontation, command, release. Something is identified as present that shouldn't be. Someone with authority speaks directly to it, not to the person, but to the thing inside the person. The thing is commanded to leave. And sometimes it does. Across traditions that share no theology, no history, no common language, the same structure. Now, here's where it starts to feel strange. These rituals don't just exist in ancient texts or isolated villages. They're happening now. Estimates suggest millions of exorcisms are performed annually worldwide. In the United States alone, the number of trained exorcists within the Catholic Church has reportedly grown significantly over the past 2 decades. Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity, where deliverance ministry is central, is among the fastest-growing religious movements on earth, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. This isn't a relic. This isn't something that survived because people forgot to stop doing it. People are actively choosing it. People who have access to psychiatry, to medication, to therapy, to every tool modern medicine offers, are also seeking this. Sometimes instead of those things, sometimes alongside them, and sometimes by any observable measure, they're helped. There's a concept in psychology called the placebo effect, and most people understand it as, you feel better because you think you're being treated. But that's an incomplete description. Because the placebo effect doesn't just produce feelings, it produces measurable physiological changes. Reduced cortisol, changed neural firing patterns, altered immune response, real, physical, documentable change in the body. Which means the belief that something is happening can make something actually happen. Not imagined, not performed, actually happening in the measurable sense. And that raises a question worth sitting with. If belief can produce real physiological change, what happens when a person believes with complete sincerity that something is being driven out of them? That they are being made clean? That the authority speaking over them has the power to restore them? What happens in the body? What happens in the brain? There's something psychologists call dissociation. It's a state where the normal integration of identity, memory, perception, and behavior breaks down. The self becomes fragmented. Parts of a person's experience feel disconnected from other parts. In mild forms, most people have experienced it: driving somewhere and not remembering the route, zoning out during a conversation, feeling unreal or like you're watching yourself from outside. In more severe forms, dissociation can look like what has historically been described as possession, a person acting in ways inconsistent with their known personality, speaking in voices not their own, having no memory of what they did or said during the episode, feeling, genuinely, that something other than themselves was in control. This isn't fabricated. It isn't performance. It's a real psychological state that real people experience. And here's what's worth noticing. Dissociative states often emerge in response to trauma, to unbearable stress, to situations where the integrated self can't cope with what's being experienced, and so it fractures. It creates distance. It allows another version of experience to take over. It's a protection mechanism, a way of surviving what can't be survived as oneself. And exorcism rituals, across their many forms, create the conditions for that fracture to heal. Let's think about what those conditions actually are. When someone undergoes an exorcism, they're typically surrounded by people who are absolutely certain about what's happening. There is no ambiguity in the room about the nature of the problem or the nature of the solution. The problem has a name. The solution has a structure. The authority figure performing the ritual believes completely in what they're doing. The community gathered believes completely in what they're witnessing. This is different from a therapy session, where a clinician is trained to hold uncertainty, to explore, to avoid premature conclusions. This is different from a medical consultation, where probabilities are discussed and treatments are presented as attempts rather than certainties. In an exorcism, everyone in the room is operating from a shared framework of absolute certainty, and that certainty does something. There's a concept in therapeutic theory called the therapeutic frame. It's the idea that the conditions surrounding a treatment, the setting, the authority of the practitioner, the expectations of the patient, the meaning given to the procedure, shape the outcome of the treatment as much as the procedure itself. A pill given by someone the patient trusts, in a context that signals healing, with full explanation of expected effects, works better than the same pill given in an ambiguous context by someone who seems uncertain. The frame matters. And exorcism rituals have perhaps the most powerful therapeutic frame imaginable. The authority figure is operating from divine commission. The setting is sacred. The procedure has been performed thousands of times and is understood by everyone present to have worked before. The person being healed is not a patient being treated. They are a battleground where a cosmic victory is being won. That framing is total. There is no outside perspective being offered. There is no suggestion that this might not work. And into that total frame, the person being exorcised is invited to release. Here's something about naming that keeps returning. When something that has been hidden or unnamed is given a name, when the shapeless thing is called by a specific thing, something changes. This shows up in psychology. One of the most consistent findings in trauma research is that the ability to name what happened, to say, this is what was done to me, this is what I carry, produces measurable relief. Not cure, but relief, movement, the beginning of integration. It shows up in ordinary experience. The moment a doctor says what you have is X can produce immediate relief even before treatment begins. The uncertainty was its own torment. The name makes it survivable. In exorcism rituals, the naming is central. The practitioner names the afflicting entity, commands it to identify itself, speaks to it directly. And in doing so, they give the person something extraordinarily useful. A distinction between themselves and what's tormenting them. Whatever the psychological reality of what's happening, whether it's a genuinely external entity, a dissociated part of the self, a manifestation of trauma, or something else entirely, the act of naming it as not you creates the possibility of separation. If it has a name, it can be addressed. If it can be addressed, it can be commanded. If it can be commanded, it can be expelled. The ontological question, is it real, becomes in this framework secondary to the functional question, Does treating it as real allow the person to heal? There's something called the nocebo effect, which is the placebo effect's inverse. If placebo is belief that you're being helped produces real improvement, nocebo is belief that something is harming you produces real harm. People who are told they've been exposed to a toxin experience symptoms of toxicity even when they haven't been exposed to anything. People who are told they'll have a side effect from a medication develop that side effect at higher rates than those who aren't told. The belief in harm produces real harm, which means the belief in affliction, in possession, in oppression, in something wrong at a deep level, might also produce real symptoms, not consciously, not as performance, but as the body and mind responding to what they believe to be true about themselves. Which means exorcism may be treating something that belief itself partially created, not fabricated, not imagined. Real suffering with real symptoms arising at least partly from a framework that says this person is afflicted, and real relief with real physiological change arising from a framework that says this person is being freed. Here's what I keep coming back to. In Western psychological and psychiatric tradition, we also have rituals for this kind of healing. They just don't look like rituals. A person goes to a clinician's office, they sit in a specific chair, the clinician sits across from them in a specific posture. There's a 50-minute hour, there are particular phrases the clinician uses, particular responses that signal the session is proceeding correctly. The person is given a diagnosis, a name for what's wrong, a framework for understanding themselves and their suffering. And then over time, they're helped to separate themselves from what they believed was simply who they were. That depressive voice, that's not you. That's a symptom. That destructive behavior, that's not you. That's an adaptation. That overwhelming shame, that's not you. That's something that was done to you. The goal in both traditions is the same: to create a distinction between the person and what's tormenting them, to give the person a way to say, that is not me. To provide an authoritative framework within which release becomes possible. The mechanisms are different, the metaphysics are different, the explanations are completely different. But the structure is remarkably similar. There's an anthropologist named Janice Body who spent years studying spirit possession in Sudan. And she noticed something that disrupted her initial assumptions. She went in expecting to find women who had been deceived into believing they were possessed, suffering from something that was being misidentified and mislabeled by their community. What she found was more complex. The possession ceremonies she observed gave women access to something they had no other way of accessing, a space where their suffering could be named, witnessed, and addressed publicly. A space where they could say, through the frame of possession, things that couldn't be said otherwise. A space where the community was obligated to respond. The spirit possession wasn't just a mistaken diagnosis of psychological illness. It was a socially sanctioned container for experiences that the culture had no other way of holding. And the exorcism, or in some cases the accommodation of the spirit rather than expulsion, was the community's way of saying, we see what you carry, we are taking it seriously, we are doing something about it. That's not nothing. That's actually profound. It's worth noticing that the traditions which practice exorcism most actively tend to be the ones where affliction is understood as having an external cause. You're not sick because something went wrong with your brain chemistry. You're afflicted because something outside of you, a spirit, a curse, an enemy, an evil force, is working against you. This framing has a quality that the internal cause framing doesn't have. If the problem is inside you, if it's your brain, your trauma, your genetics, your unprocessed childhood, then you are the site of the problem. The problem is you. But if the problem is external, if something entered you, something attacked you, something was done to you from outside, then you are a victim of something, not the source of it. You can be innocent. You can be fought for. Someone with authority can stand between you and what's tormenting you, face it directly, and command it to leave. That's a completely different emotional and psychological experience than being handed a diagnosis that locates the dysfunction inside your own self. There's a moment that practitioners describe across traditions in different language where they know the ritual is working. Sometimes there's resistance, agitation, something that doesn't want to go. And then there's a moment of collapse, or stillness, or a sound, or a visible change in the person's face and body. And the person emerges from it reporting something consistent, a feeling of lightness, of something being lifted, of a clarity they couldn't access before. Not always, not every time, but often enough that the practitioners believe in what they're doing, and often enough that the people being helped come back and tell others. There's a question embedded in all of this that I don't think has a clean answer. If a ritual produces real change, observable, measurable, lasting change in a person's psychological and physical state, does it matter what the mechanism is? Does the person whose dissociative symptoms resolve after an exorcism need to understand why it worked? Does the anthropologist or the psychologist or the neuroscientist who can describe the mechanism, do they understand something more important than the person who was changed? Or do they understand something different? Something about how, while perhaps missing something about what? I keep thinking about the word deliver. Deliverance is what many traditions call what happens in these rituals. You are delivered, as in, you are brought from one place to another, as in, someone carries you across a threshold you couldn't cross yourself, as in, you are released from something that was holding you. The word doesn't say whether the holding was supernatural or psychological or both or neither. It just says, you were held, and now you're free. And maybe that's the part that matters most. Not the explanation, not the mechanism, not whether the entity named was literal or metaphorical, but whether the person in the room, the person who came in shaking, not themselves, held by something they couldn't name alone, whether they left different, whether they were, in whatever sense that word carries, delivered. So when that person in the folding chair, or the church pew, or the ceremonial space, or the clinic, with its specific rituals of its own, when they go through the procedure and emerge changed, maybe the most honest thing we can say is, something happened. We have different languages for what it was. We have different frameworks for why it worked. We have different metaphysics, different ontologies, different explanations. But the person who was not themselves became themselves again, and the people in the room who loved them recognized that return. And everyone present knew, in their own way, that something had been driven out, or integrated, or named and released, or healed, depending on which language fits what you already believe. If this brought up something for you, a thought, a question, maybe even a disagreement, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Not looking for answers, just what this made you think about. I read every one, and if this was worth your time, please subscribe, like, and share. It really helps us keep making these. Thanks for watching.